And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center. Facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course the mothership at coalition.radio.us, where you'll find links to our YouTube page, our podcast page, and of course our Liberty News, where we'll continue to deliver messages from a variety of civil rights, civil liberty, and, well, some civilly disobedient organizations. Want to get right to it. Just kind of a record for guests tonight. I think we're on our 5th guest in the space of 3 hours. And I think it's been a civil rights kind of night. Joining me again is now someone who's a frequent offender here on the Coalition, someone who's got the key to the door anytime he wants to come in and talk. Of course, I'm talking about Connor Dricotas. He is a libertarian activist. He can be found at connordricotas.com, as well as being a professional in messaging, video messaging, political issues, political consulting, and he joins us from the far hills of Pennsylvania. Connor, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. Excited to be here. I've been listening in, and it's been very fascinating to hear some of these stories, and honestly kind of concerning in a lot of ways. Not a lot of great news at the end of the day, but hopefully we can end your night with a little bit of a smile.
Well, the great news is that there are people out there fighting it. I don't doubt that a lot of us, this has gone on behind the scenes for generations. What we're seeing here with the current administration is nothing less than a redux, if you will. Well, what does your generation call it? A reboot of some of the failures of our past, and that we seem desperately intent on reproducing. But when you hear a situation where someone is facing imminent death, is incapable of getting a fair trial, whose family has been tortured, and you come to understand that the United States State Department is actively looking to send him back to a certain death, I don't think that's the script we're used to hearing in Hollywood, is it? I mean, it's revolting. I don't know how else to put it. I haven't spoken to you much, because we've been focusing on immigration so much tonight. I keep talking about the trip to Mexico, but that has and always will be a searing memory in my mind for exactly what's going on. So it's a real function of our ability to, continue to fight the good fight, and to continue to challenge these issues when it comes from a side of the bench that we've been taught to believe was all about truth in the American way. And I think that's the saddest part, because, my comment, not yours, but I'm just going to say that it's clear that the Republicans have no clothes. They have blown up our financial situation as a nation. They have clearly moved away from liberty on a domestic basis and embraced an authoritarian state. And now when we look to foreign policy, when Americans are supposed to be the shining city on the hill, this is their State Department, man. They own this shit. I don't know what else to say.
It's true. Well, I mean, the Republican Party is interesting. If you look at some of the underlying studies about how to appeal to both the right and the left from a marketing perspective, what you see a lot of the time is that on the right, the underlying principles that you would want to appeal to with your messaging have to do with law and justice. And in this case, especially around, examples at the border and what's going on, it's almost taking that to the nth degree. Because there's a law on the books, even if it's a bad law, even if it's an immoral law, there is a kind of natural tendency in that culture to say, well, hey, it's a law, and just because it's a law, it should be followed through on. And the result is, both on the border internationally, and as I've been writing about domestically, it's creating huge problems, and that's one of the reasons why criminal justice reform has been such a hot topic these days from both sides of the aisle. So it's finally getting to that point where people are starting to say, all right, let's put a stop here. Let's really evaluate this system and find out if it's establishing the goals that it's supposed to, because you do have to balance that law with the idea of justice. And right now, the law doesn't seem to be very just in a lot of situations.
Right, and as a final thought to this, kind of an exclamation point, clearly the current administration has little or no respect for international law or treaties. In this case, the attorney talked about CAT, which is an international treaty specifically prohibiting, if you will, taking prisoners and bringing them back to nations which engage in active torture. That's not fake news. That's not some international conspiracy. We're talking about fundamental human rights. So perhaps the most disturbing point is, given this administration's cavalier attitude towards treaties, one wonders if by the time they're done, will we have any legitimacy whatsoever internationally to engage in treaties that are, well, to our benefit. So, talk to us about what Connor Dricotas is writing this week.
Well, I guess what we had been chatting about earlier before we were on the air is there has been some growing interest around an article that I put together that was titled "Felons Deserve Rights," which is, I guess, inherently a little bit of a kind of a buzz of a title, but it was also republished by a couple folks as "I am a felon and so are you." And I wanted to just bring attention to that issue that in America right now, the vast majority, if not every American, is a criminal under our current law, simply because the law in many ways is nonsensical. In the article, I mentioned that it can be a felony to take a cucumber out of the Carolinas or to mislabel ham turkey as turkey ham and put them in different fonts. And when you talk about the punishment that comes along with being a felon in America, where you can lose your right to travel, your right to adopt children, your right to see your biological children, lose your Second Amendment rights, your right to vote, allowing these kind of laws to run our lives and put all of us at risk of sacrificing our fundamental freedoms, it's a crisis, and it's something that criminal justice reform more generally needs to address in the coming years. Otherwise, we put far too much power to persecute American citizens in the hands of the federal government.
Yeah, and I think I pointed out to you in an earlier piece that we had done where here in Rhode Island, incredibly enough, if you are a convicted felon on a life sentence, you are, as far as your civic rights, you are actually legally declared dead. So,
yeah.
So if you have additional issues that you'd like to educate in our quote-unquote criminal reformed criminal justice system, you literally have no rights. You're dead.
Right.
And I believe...
Well, the Providence Journal just put out an article, I believe it was last week, that said Rhode Island regulations can make it impossible for ex-inmates to get jobs. And obviously that doesn't just have to do with felonies, but what it speaks to, especially in Rhode Island, is the fact that the system is so skewed that it's actually not accomplishing the goals that it's supposed to. I'd like to think that people want the criminal justice system and the courts to result in people reintegrating in society, quote unquote, doing their time and then getting back to living their lives in their communities. And if that's not even possible, what is our criminal justice system doing? And what can we possibly do to fix it? Probably most importantly, how fast can we get it done? Because we have a lot of people now who are being impacted every single day in their lives.
Right, and there's a tendency, particularly on the political right, to simply damn people to an eternal living hell because at one point in their life they did something bad, and despite the notion that unless it's murder, and unless it's a life sentence, that they're, by definition, the system calls for a rebirth, if you will. There are those folks who take almost a cynical pleasure in it until one day they wake up and find that either they or somebody in their family is now part of that system, trapped, as it were. What are some of the more egregious examples that you found?
Well, as I was going through, I think the single most egregious thing that I found was not actually a specific law, but it was actually true that Congress was set to the task of accounting for all of the federal crimes. And the chair of the committee actually had to report back in the House that they did not have the manpower to undertake that task, meaning that the sheer number and vast scope of these laws is just a massive problem. But for people who care about liberty, and especially in libertarian circles, one of the ones that I found most interesting was that endeavoring to obstruct the due administration of taxes is a crime. And that is something that you can be persecuted for. And as I look around and I the number of times that I've seen statuses or other people saying taxation is theft, directly spending huge portions of their lives dedicating themselves to obstructing the due administration of taxes, it really raises some red flags, about free speech, but also just about your ability to speak out on an issue that is so central to our freedoms as Americans. It's really incredible. And Dan Berman, who literally changed his middle name to taxation is theft, right? I mean, talk about putting yourself between the crosshairs. It's out of control.
Yeah, and as much as I like to see Mr. Berman, please throw that hat away, please. I do applaud his sincerity and his literally a lifelong commitment to the cause. And he is one of our presidential candidates, I'd like to note, and I hope to have him on the show very soon. But that's the point, isn't it? I mean, judicial systems are set up and worded, I'm convinced, intentionally to be used against people when appropriate. I mean, there are no absolutes in judicial law, it would seem. It's all conditional. And I harken back to a now past former mayor, a political legend in these parts, one Vincent A. Buddy Cianci, who was convicted of conspiracy a few years back and jailed based on conspiracy to commit RICO violations or some such stuff. I'm not a lawyer. But any of the other 20 or so things which would have comprised the actual violations of the RICO statutes, he was found not guilty of. So in the halls of justice, as we say here at the Coalition, justice is in the halls. And so it appeared to many of us at the time that they decided that after a lifelong of being sort of a robber baron and a rogue, that it was time for Vincent Buddy Cianci to go to jail for a while. That it was just time. And, we didn't need any damn laws to convict him of. We just needed a law that kind of said it was time for Vincent A. Buddy Cianci to go to jail. And so began the slow unwinding, if you will, of a political legend who had stood up to the powers, if you will, for generations.
Was he I don't know, I'm not familiar with that story, but it does occur to me that if he Republican or Democrat,
he was an independent.
He was independent. Okay, so I mean, geez, talk about putting yourselves in the crosshairs. But one of the things that's relevant there is criminal justice reform is increasingly a bipartisan issue, and like is often the case in the long term, people who are on the side of liberty are being vindicated about that, right? I mean, people who care about liberty have been talking about criminal justice reform and scaling back some of these punishments for a long, long time. And one of the things I wanted to make sure that I talked about tonight is that anybody listening to this program or watching this program who cares about liberty, criminal justice reform is an incredibly unique opportunity, because it's bipartisan right now, to build coalitions with people on both sides of the aisle. Because we're so aligned with everyone seems to be pushing in the same direction. This is just a great opportunity to, go out, say, hey, we're on the same page, build those relationships. And the political capital there in future battles could really be powerful, because if we're all on the same side, we can leverage those relationships in future issues in the years to come.
Right. And I think one of the most important areas on a seemingly simplistic level, but yet still foreign to most state governments, is what's called ban-the-box legislation. I don't know if you're familiar with ban-the-box, but
yes.
Ban-the-box means that the first question at the very top of the employment application doesn't have to be, were you convicted of a felony? That is ultimately disclosed to the employer, but at a certain point, it allows the employee not to be completely pre-screened, that they're given some opportunity at redemption. That's the word I was searching for before, And we are a society allegedly built on redemption. And redemption should not be reserved for just football players, but redemption should be reserved for the everyman who finds themselves, in some cases, literally stealing that proverbial loaf of bread, as we saw this week. We saw a famous actress clearly engage in fraud and subjugate a critical component of our educational system, be given for 14 days in jail. And the whining and the caterwauling could be heard all the way across the country because, my God, she was going to jail. And yet we're all aware of folks who got busted with weed who've been serving for years in jail because that happened to be their third strikeout. There's been little or no attempt to moderate criminal sentences and the after effect of criminal sentences with the reality of day-to-day life. And and I think you're absolutely right. There is ample opportunity now particularly for libertarians, if they can't seek coalition, if they can't get it because of the insane politics, if you will, of the duopoly, then clearly it represents an opportunity where on multiple levels they can reach out to Americans and say, okay, we understand the need to punish people, but we also need proportion and rationality to people. Possession of a plant should not end a potentially productive lifestyle. Possession of a over medicated, in the case of the opioid epidemic, possession of a drug which they become an addict of and they weren't involved in distribution should not become a felony which prevents you from any one of a number of careers. And let's be blunt, think of how many careers are ended because of the presence of a felony violation.
Absolutely.
Also,
well, there are some. There are still people on the fringes. I know I'm definitely painting a picture, and I don't want to be overly optimistic and say every single person in America is on board with the criminal justice reform train, because what we do see on the fringes still are what I believe is one of the most insulting things that people can say about criminal justice reform, which is, well, why don't you just not commit crimes? And in this article, the point that I was trying to make is exactly that. It's really not if you're a felon. It's just when someone decides to punish you for the things that you could do. Some of the other examples that I pointed to, getting lost in the woods and crossing into a federal park, entering someone's password into their computer, going ahead and taking a sick day when you're not actually sick. These are all things that can have drastic implications on your life. And they're little things that a lot of people do without realizing every single day. So as soon as someone decided that they wanted to persecute you for that using the full force and power of the government, it really does put those who are not currently in power, Republican, Democrat, Independent, doesn't matter. As soon as that you are not the party in power, you're leaving those in power with a tremendous amount of leeway about how they can come down on you and ruin your life to preserve their own power.
Yeah, it's interesting, and how different crises, the timing of what you are found guilty of, can be fascinating. And I'll point to two epidemics. First off, the crack epidemic, and then, of course, now the opioid epidemic. More than one comedian recently has pointed out, tragicomically, if you will, that if you were to use the same sort of patronizing token responses that you gave to the crack epidemic, to the opioid epidemic, you'd have vastly different results. Your point, why not just not commit the crime? Well, in the case of the crack epidemic, you had, sentencing guidelines that were just hideous. And, why don't you just stop? Why don't you stop smoking crack? Whereas right now, and I'm glad there is, by the way, I'll be careful in saying this, there's a great deal of sympathy for the opioid epidemic, which is, some could point out, as a largely white suburban middle to upper middle class epidemic. There seems to be an empathy and a sympathy, well-deserved, that didn't exist for people of color when they engaged in the use of crack cocaine or heroin in its predecessor. There, the government characterized you as not a victim of a heroin addiction or of a crack addiction. You were characterized as, a low-level drug dealer, even if you were just selling to support your habit. And so it's interesting to me how much timing, how much the economic and racial strata you inhibit impacts whether or not you are handed this lifetime sentence of being a felon or not. And it seems
You're absolutely right.
it's very subjective, and justice needs to be colorblind.
Well, there's an interesting, I guess, trend happening, and I grew up in southern Maine myself in a town called Kennebunk, and it's a beautiful place, small community, but the police chief there is a gentleman by the name of Robert McKenzie, and he has actually taken it upon himself as a law enforcement officer to take a different track on that solution for the opioid crisis itself. And what he's said is that state and federal governments are not going to fix this problem. It's our communities that have the ability to do that. And the best part about that is he's partnered with an organization called Above Board for the Recovery Coach Academy, which I'd encourage your listeners to look up. But what he's done is he's taken a community-based approach. And as I understand it, this is as an outsider looking in, he's kind of said, listen, we're not going to follow up on these crimes because they're crimes on the books. They've taken the approach that these are human beings who we're going to care about. And I think as we go, criminal justice reform generally, as more police departments start viewing these problems and these crimes as human issues instead of just, hey, here's the letter of the law on the books, let's absolutely throw the book at them and toss them in a cell for the rest of their lives, or throw them in a cell and not get them the resources they need to be successful moving forward. It is a bright future. And I know that we're a few minutes away from 9 o'clock here, and I promised that I would at least have some smile, right. In this. And that is part of it, certainly, is that people are going to continue to see positive results as long as the public pressure to care about people's success continues. It's incredibly important to have empathy, to have sympathy, and to realize that these are real human beings, not just statistics, no matter even if the discussion happening in state houses across the country are just talking about broad trends.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And we had guests on very early this evening who were talking about the criminalization and warehousing of in cages, in this case a local for-profit prison, of people looking simply to come to the United States and seeking a better life. And what I found most empowering about this segment was the willingness of a group of young people. Most of the folks involved in this movement are, probably early 20s to early 30-somethings, who were taking their experience being Jewish, and many of them having family members who were directly related to, or distant cousins and relatives who were involved in the Holocaust, and saying that we will no longer allow a group of people to be marginalized and to be warehoused and dehumanized simply because they are the demons du jour of an out-of-control federal government. And when you hear moments like that, and you hear talk about banning the box, and you hear all the issues that a lot of folks are taking personally, we're talking regular folks, outside of the bubble, not your traditional activists. People are waking up to the notion that these trends are based largely on the decisions of a few to really marginalize and dehumanize and demonize people based on some form of their peopleness, their heritage, their ethnicity, their religion, their racial status, their sexuality. And the degree in this country, particularly with folks, and you're younger than I am, of your generation on down, to physically evidence not only disgust with that, I think is ennobling. And folks in my generation have one whole hell of a lot to learn, because we're responsible for a lot of the situations that exist right now in government. It's our fault. We were in charge. So I think you're right. There is there is great hope on this. We've only got a couple minutes left, but I also always want to periodically check in with you with what your temperature is on the presidential race. So in 5 or 6 minutes, if because you're watching it as a communication professional, someone who is involved in that deeply, both at a university teaching level as well as someone who works for a professional firm doing just that. So, as opposed to someone like me who's, like I said, I'm not an expert, I literally play one on the radio. Right now we've got this crowded Democratic field that's starting to winnow itself down. Who, in your opinion, right now is messaging the best? Who's really driving it home?
As we've been kicking off this semester at Lehigh, I'm teaching business communications to 60 first years and sophomores. And a lot of what we've been talking about is purpose and how you explain your purpose and how important that is to selling yourself. And I've been seeing a lot of that in the Democratic race. First and foremost, Yang, Buttigieg, and Warren are the three who I think have the best shot. I think Sanders is going to fall off. I think Biden will fall off as well, partially because of identity politics, but also because they failed to differentiate themselves. Those three, Warren, Buttigieg, and Yang, however, are unique. They make a different kind of appeal on identity politics and just because they're selling their purpose. I think we're going to see one of the three of them pull it out at the end of the day. But I'm not optimistic about any of their chances against Donald Trump unless something else comes out that really kneecaps him in some surprising way.
Yeah, I'm going to make an early prediction. I think it's going to be Warren and Buttigieg as the ticket, because I think Buttigieg actually speaks to a part of the country that's often drifted red. He's at least somewhat successful mayor of a Rust Belt town. That appeals to a group of people that is clearly not enamored with Ms. Warren, and so the two of them have the potential to be a powerful combination. I think Kamala's days are numbered, and Biden. Oof, how ironic would it be if in fact this latest Trump-esque gaffe actually dragged Biden in with his son, and clearly to me Biden and his family, in part because of the tragedy in his family's history, have escaped a lot of disclosure. They've been able to hide in plain sight a whole lot of abuses, not the least of which are his living son's engagement with the financial community and a variety of high-flung interests. I don't know. What do you think a combo like that is possible?
I think it is. I think what's going to be most interesting from a communications perspective is how they rebrand themselves after this run-up. So once we actually have one person and it's X person versus Trump, I think the person best situated to do that is going to still be Mayor Pete. My father went to Notre Dame. He still has a lot of friends who live in South Bend, where he was the mayor, and even the most conservative individuals among them, at the end of the day, they kind of have looked and said, he's a good guy. And that's very interesting to hear, because in the course of this race so far, he has been dragged left with his Douglas plan, with his redistribution plan. His reinvestment plans even have been very left-leaning, which is the right strategy at this point in the game. But if he were to become the nominee, you're going to see him move right back to the center, make a compelling argument to the vast majority of Americans. If people thought that Trump was appealing because he was the type of person who could just relate to the average man, Mayor Pete's going to be able to knock him on his butt. Again, I still don't think it's going to be enough to push him over the edge. But if he is that guy, we're going to be in for a really interesting 2020.
Well, and to that point, I mean, one only needs to remember that Clinton was a small state governor with little or no, exposure to the rest of the nation, and literally changed history. So there's you don't have to have that big picture. The nation, quite frankly, is going to be reviled by Warren. At some point in time soon, we're all going to do the sealed envelope thing. We're going to do the prediction thing, and we're we're going to come up with a pool somehow of how this ends up. Final question, because I got about a minute left. Francis Beto O'Rourke. What the prevailing wisdom right now is that his overt gun grabbing is actually destroying the Democratic Party right now, because he's essentially exposing, he's confirming to a lot of folks what most people think have always quietly feared about the Democratic Party. Is he doing that? Do you think it has that kind of resonance out in your neck of the woods?
You know what a big Second Amendment guy I am. I'm a huge believer in the right to self-defense for all people. This relates to criminal justice reform as well. Felons lose their gun rights. There are a lot of people who are really going to be frustrated by this. However, I don't think it's going to be Democrats who are going to be the ones who stray away from that. Now that it's out there, it can be normalized, and
Wow.
he might just be the man to do it. A lot of people will see that as a viable path forward at this point on the left. But if Trump keeps pushing various gun measures forward, we're headed in that direction from both sides of the aisle. And as often happens, those who care about liberty might just be left stuck standing in the middle, hoping for the best.
Great stuff, because that hadn't occurred to me. The two things I'd like to talk about the next time you're on the air in a couple of weeks is normalization, how media and culture takes what would have once been considered, and abortion is probably a perfect example of that. How did abortion and now how did gun grabbing become normalized? And just as intriguingly, a number of the people in the election clearly at this point are jockeying for either future think tank positions and or future ambassadorships or future cabinet posts. I'd love over the next couple of weeks to watch as the field winnows what type of political affiliations you see taking place between these candidates. Yang the most interesting. I think that's great fodder for conversation.
I'll look forward to it. That sounds like a lot of fun, actually.
All right. God bless you, lad. He is Connor Dricotas. ConnerDrigotas.com. You'll see his stuff linked throughout us. We're going to continue. He's created his own website now, his own approach, his own thoughts. We're going to do everything that we can here in the coalition to amplify them. And again, I want to thank you for taking the time on a Friday night to join us.
Always. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Thanks so much.
All right, buddy. We're going to sign off for tonight. It has been arguably, I believe, what do they say, IMHO? Because of our guests, not me, but because of our guests, one of the most compelling evenings we've had on the coalition. Some very human faces on some very complicated issues, and folks who embrace the concept we've advocated in our 7 years to hashtag take it very personally. I want to always thank our sponsors. Listen, for your Halloween party, there's Vampire's Blood Orange Mango Soda. It's the bomb, bud. All right. Yacht Club, 100 plus years in business. Rhode Island's boutique soda. Before we knew we needed a boutique soda, YachtClubBottlingWorks.com. Air Sciences, airscience.net. Darryl Gould and his Hardy Group, fighting mold remediation, biohazards in your home, your school, and your office, making all of those a safer place for Rhode Islanders. As always, folks, airsciences.net. If you've got a situation where someone in your family or friend is autoimmune challenged, please reach out to them. They've got special programs available for them. And of course, Beacon Shipping and Logistics. You got a car, you need it to go somewhere, they're the ones to use. 1-800-34-SHIP-IT. BeaconShippingAndLogistics.com, international automobile shipping company that's based right here in Little Rhodey in Warwick, Rhode Island. 1-855, I should correct, 3-SHIP-IT. BeaconShippingAndLogistics.com. We'll be back next week. Thanks again for joining us.